Good morning. The sun kind of shining in my eye, reflecting off of something there. Anyway, today we look at Leviticus 13, one chapter. But it's, to me, it's one of the chapters, especially in Leviticus, that when if a person is set out to read the Bible, you read, oh, I got this is, you just quit. It's one of those that it just seems to be the same stuff. And how do you understand all this? It's talking about leprosy. And the difference in if a person has this disease of the skin, leprosy, it is a rash. It'll start out a rash and it's white, and if it turns the hair white, and if it's this and that, and they have to go show themselves to the priest. I mean, in leprosy, we all know that it's a contagious disease. And I've always wondered about that. Well, you go show yourself to the priest. Well, were the priests somehow not able to get leprosy that they could check these people out? But anyway, that's totally beside the point. But it starts out talking about the diagnosis of leprosy. When a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns leprous disease, and he shall be brought to Aaron the priest. And one of the first things that always comes to my mind is, the old pimples, the old whiteheads, we'd get, and I mean, but that was kind of a different story too. But anyway, with this, the leprosy would affect the hand or the arm or, any position, any part of the body. And they would go to the priest, and the priest would examine the disease, it says. And if the hair had turned white and the disease appeared deeper than the skin, if it wasn't just on the top, but if it was a sore that, got down into the skin, then it was leprous, and he would be unclean, this person, he or she would be unclean and would have to stay separate. And it doesn't say that right in this early part of chapter 13, but they would be confined, they would be, they wouldn't be able to just go home and live among your family and continue in your everyday life, but you were confined. And then 7 days later, they would check you again, to see if it had cleared up or if it had gotten worse or if it continued to be the same. And if it was still determined leprosy, well, you were confined another 7 days. And, and then it's, the person is unclean. It's a leprous disease. And then, I don't know, there's one place, when we get down into like verse 13, the priest will make an examine. And if the disease has covered all of the body, he will pronounce him clean of the disease. So if your whole body is covered, well, then you're clean. I mean, how can that be? I don't understand some of this stuff. And I read through it and I think, okay, what's different here? I mean, if it's just a spot or an arm or a part of your face, something. But here, if it's your whole body is covered with this, I mean, but then again, if raw flesh appears, well, then he's unclean. And so, it's just, but I read through this and I just kind of groaned to myself, and I do that when I read this all of the time. In verse 18 again, when there is skin on of one's body, a boil that is healed. And in the place of the boil there appears this white spot or a reddish swelling, the priest will make an examination. And if it's deeper than the skin or the hair is turned white, person will be unclean, And verse 24, if the body has a burn on the skin and raw flesh, if the burn becomes a spot, and so, I mean, you get a burn on your body and you get, a blister. And I mean, so this would be one of those things that they would then watch, if this blister, continues, if it gets reddish white or white, they examine it. And if the hair, is deeper than, or if it's deeper than the skin, if it, but I mean, this is one of the things that, that happens. I mean, people get burns. I mean, not maybe so often in today's world as it used to be, but we get burns. You accidentally grab something or something spills on you, And it would be one of those things that would then have to be watched and everything. And I kind of chuckled when I got to verse 29 in this paragraph. When a man or a woman has a disease on the head or in the beard, they will be examined. And if it's deeper than the skin, the priest will pronounce him unclean. And it goes on. If the person is bald, and I mean I'm not bald. I got hair. It's just really light colored. You can't see it very well, but there's nothing wrong with being bald, it says, as long as there's not leprosy on. That's, coming from in verse 40 by the time you're reading all the way through from where I started in 29. But if anyone loses the hair from his head, he is bald, but he is clean, so, and I mean, I remember as a kid growing up, that there would be, I would see, these elderly men that were bald and everything. And now I know that there are people that, they get to a point like where my hair is thin and light, and they'll shave their heads every day. And so they look bald, but they're not bald. But anyway, that's totally beside the point. But, so it was just, we put some of these stigmas on people sometimes, and I remember, when I was in my early 20s, I suppose, that talking with a person, and he noticed, the way my hairline was, kind of, and he said, "Look at here," and I said, "That's the way my hair's been all my life," but it was, it's one of those things that we think about, it's a point of looking good. Anyway, verse 45 is where we come to a sticky point, because, the person who has the leprous disease will wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head be disheveled, and he will cover his upper lip. I mean, what's it mean to cover your upper lip? No shave or something? Or, I don't know, but what do you cover your upper lip? But regardless, but you will cry out, "Unclean, unclean," so that if, you're not maybe, like it said in the early part, they will be set aside, or they will be confined, so they're not confined all the time, but when you're out there, if someone comes, unclean, unclean. And that's, in the story in the New Testament of Jesus, when the lepers, the 10 lepers that were there, they had to live apart, separate, outside of the city, and they depended upon the generosity of people to, bring food and different things there for them. And it was, if someone started coming by, it was unclean, unclean, stay away from me so you don't get sick too, because it was such a communicable disease, and it says he will remain unclean as long as he has a disease, and he will live alone, and his dwelling shall be outside the camp, So there was not only the stigma of it, but it was, you were excluded from community. You weren't confined into a house or a hospital. You were boom out. And I always wondered, well, how do you get cured of this disease of leprosy? And that was, one of the deals was, that you go to the priest, you show yourself to the priest. If they declare you clean, well, you're clean. Well, maybe one of the ways was earlier when the whole body would then become, but regardless. And then we're done talking about the people being unclean with leprosy, and then we start to talk about the clothing being unclean. Verse 47, concerning clothing, when a leprous disease appears in it, in woolen or linen cloth, in the warp or the woof of linen or wool, and I remembered, I looked up what warp and woof meant last year. I'm sure I looked it up, and yep, sure enough, if I turn the page and look, the warp is the lengthwise thread, and the woof is the, so it's, as the threads are woven together, it's the length and the width, and why don't they change those wordings in our Bible? So it says length and width instead of warp and woof. But if the clothing is moldy or filled with mildew, and you think about wool and linen cloth, and the practices they had of the day, and this the mold and stuff could get in there and grow. We know how mold works yet today. And so then, the clothing had to be He shall burn the clothing, whether diseased in warp or woof, woolen or linen, or, that way. And so it talks about all of that stuff concerning leprosy, this whole chapter. And as I said at the beginning, this is one of the chapters in Leviticus especially that you get to and you just say, oh, do I really want to keep reading this? But, it's instructions for the Israelites as to how to live together as God's people, and God is providing for their needs and a way of taking care of the illnesses within it. So it's, I'm not going to give up on reading, and I hope you don't either.